Hello, and welcome back to another update where we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one, we have several Russian advances in the Kursk section of the front line. We also have Russian advances in the Kremmina part, in the Siversk section, north of New York into a new settlement, in the Kurakhove section of the front line, and in the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line. Russians are continuing offensive operations all throughout the front line as they continue to grind down the Ukrainian defenses and the Ukrainians' attempts to hold on to the situation at the front line and prevent a Russian breakthrough. Starting out in the Kursk direction, the Russians have recaptured the northern parts of Vuhledar and are closing in on the Ukrainian positions from the eastern and western direction. The objective of the Russians here is to push the Ukrainians completely out of the Kursk region, so we see continuous Russian efforts to push the Ukrainians out, and the Ukrainians continue their offensive operations in an attempt to gain control over Silova and then push towards Kurakhove. The Russians also continue their push here in the east, where heavy fighting is taking place by Lyubimovka and Svetlikovo. The Ukrainians are attempting to launch some counterattacks in that direction to push the Russians back to the river line and regain control over some of these areas, but the Russians are also continuing their own operations, which ends up in massive clashes taking place within these settlements. The Russians managed to recapture some territory in the northern parts of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion, but have managed to regain control over several settlements and push the Ukrainians back a bit in one of the deepest areas they have managed to advance within. Heavy fighting continues in the direction of Kurakhove, where the Russians are shelling the Ukrainian positions within the settlement as they have prepared positions outside of the settlement in preparation for an assault towards the settlement, but ahead of such an assault they're heavily bombarding it. In the Kremmina section of the front line, we see that the Russians have managed to expand their zone of control west of Makiivka. Following the control over the settlements, the Russians have now crossed over the Serbets river line and have started offensive operations here in the western bank. This is combined with the recent push across in the northern parts, signaling the control over the general possessions here near the river line. The eastern bank is almost entirely under Russian control, and this has allowed the Russians to significantly expand the areas where they are able to conduct river crossings. With this expansion of areas, they can attack in multiple parts. The Ukrainians would be forced to spread out their forces to cover the entire area, and therefore the Russians can break through some of these positions. These are both likely just probing attacks where the Russians will be attempting to check out the Ukrainian defenses in the area, see if there's any gaps in their defenses, to then take advantage of and launch operations either in the direction of Borova or Oskil in the south. Or generally, there are 4 crossings: Kupiansk, Zinkove, Borova, and Oskil. All 4 of these crossings are near areas where the Russians are attempting a crossing. We have in the north by Sinkivka, where the Russians can launch operations towards Kupiansk. We have near Pishane, where the Russians are very near the settlements of Zinkove. We have a crossing near Stelmahivka, which is in the direction of Borova, and now a crossing around Makiivka towards Oskil. So it could be a direct assault towards all of the crossings in a combined operation to gain full control over the eastern bank of the Oskil river line, but gaining control over the crossings and therefore limiting the supplies of the Ukrainians being able to pass over the Oskil river line to none. Further south, there are a lot of reports coming in that the Russians have managed to capture Verkhnokamiansk. Syriac Maps has announced that he has yet to be able to verify this information. However, due to the amount of sources claiming this to be true, I found a bunch of news sources that I've been following for the past few weeks. They seem very accurate and in line with what Syriac Maps reports. So I'm changing it to the Russians having control over it, but this could change, so keep your eyes out for this settlement. But if the Russians manage to capture it, this is a 10 square kilometer advance, and they are now within 4 kilometers of Siversk, halving this distance between the front line and Siversk in a single assault, covering multiple fortified positions, a whole settlement, and then reaching to the outskirts of Siversk is a significant advance. There is 2 possibilities. Either there has been a fight going on for the settlement for quite a few days, but there's been no reports about it, or the Ukrainian defenses in the area have been weakened due to heavy Russian assaults and bombardment, which forced them to withdraw and the Russians entered an empty settlement. Either of these two cases could be true, but we do see that the Russians here to the south of Verkhnokamiansky had some advances, and based on the footage, there was some shelling, FPV drones, and so on, covering that advance, which means that it is likely that the Ukrainians were still present within Verkhnokamiansky. So therefore, the first option, which is heavy fighting taking place over the settlement, is likely to be the case, and the Russians simply had a strong enough push and force to gain control over the settlements despite Ukrainian resistance. In the direction of New York, we see that the Russians have advanced further north of Nilipivka, gaining control of the remaining parts of the settlement and entering Sherbinivka as they continue offensive operations here in the direction of Leonidivka and the western flank of Toretsk. It is likely that the Russians will expand their offensive operations here in the New York direction to gain control over the fortified positions, the village agglomeration, and flanking Toretsk further as they continue operations within the city itself and on the western flank of it. In the Kurakhove section of the front line, the Russians continued their push here to the south of the industrial area, southeast of Sukharina. The Russians have managed to gain control over the fortified positions just next to it and have pushed along the road here between Sukharina and Novoselidivka, where they've managed to gain a push towards Novoselidivka, where they've reached the outskirts of it. There's no reports of a foothold gain yet, but fighting at the outskirts of the settlement. And again, this is exactly what I was talking about. The Russians are going to continue pushing here along the front line as they want to encircle Ukrainian forces in between this direction here as drawn out on the map and everything east of it to be encircled, as Russians will look to gain control over the entire area in between the front line and the Vuhledar River, and they already have control over the crossing here in the east, which would mean that gaining control over this area here would mean that every single Ukrainian soldier in the east would be cut off from supplies and would have no exit. This brings me to a 4-stage analysis that I'm making based on the current situation at the front line. I believe that the Russians have 4 stages of offensive operations to meet the front line here near Kurakhove with the ones near Vuhledar. The first stage of such an operation would be to secure Vuhledar in the southern flank, where the objective would be to reach the outskirts of Bohoyavlinka and Novoukrayinka. In the north, it would be to gain control over Sukharina and the general area here between the two to launch operations towards Novoselidovo and along the railways. The second stage would be to capture Novoukrayinka and Bohoyavlinka in the south. This will allow for the Russians to expand their zone of control in the area and launch operations on a wider front. This will further secure their positions north of the river line and allow for further offensive operations in the northern direction. In the south, it would be to gain control over Novoselidovo and the railway south of Sukharina to reach the Vuhledar river line. The third stage would be to gain control over a much wider area. The objective here would be to gain control over Maximivka, Yasna Polyana, Shakhtarsk, and Solotaniva. The third stage in the north would be to gain control over Selidove, the road here along the Selidove all the way down south to the Vuhledar river line, securing the encirclement of the Ukrainian forces in the east and gaining control over the roads to supply from Novohrodivka all the way down south to the Vuhledar river line. This will significantly improve their positions in the area, secure an encirclement of the Ukrainian forces in the east, and allow for further offensive operations. The fourth stage is the connection between the two fronts. The Russians will launch an assault along the roads to gain control over Rusliv and Constantinople in the south. This will be the fourth stage in the Vuhledar section of the front line, and the Russian forces in the north by Kurakhove will launch an operation to gain control over Petropavlivka and Rivka and Shevchenkova. This will connect the two fronts and allow the Russians to not just encircle the Ukrainian forces in the east, but every single soldier and defensive position in the Kurakhove section of the front line. And this will significantly improve the Russian positions in the area. It will allow the railway between Mariupol and Donetsk to be used completely unopposed, from artillery shelling, drones, and so on, force the Ukrainians to use long-range MLRS such as HIMARS to attack, and that would be so close to the front line that would be in a vulnerable position. Otherwise, they would use Storm Shadow missiles, which they have a limited amount of. So generally, the railway will be able to be used regularly by the Russian forces, and that will significantly improve the supply situation in the entire Donetsk region, as the Russians can freely use railways to supply close to the front line, and trucks will be able to use several highways, the Kurakhove highway, the Karelivka highway, and the railways near Avdiivka. There are several supply lines towards Pokrovsk, and a battle over the city can take place with this well-supplied section of the front line. Therefore, I believe that this will be one combined offensive, gaining control over Selidove and connecting the two front lines to then cut off the Ukrainian positions near Kurakhove and Karelivka. In the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line, there's a small advance by the Russians along the main highway between Novopokrovka and Novodanilivka, as the Russians continue offensive operations in the direction of Orikhiv, where they have done a lot of positional fighting to regain control over Robotyne and their defensive lines of the Surovikin line, and now they are developing operations further towards Novodanilivka, as they can change the defense to positional fighting to now an offensive in the future. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.